and welcome to the Southeast Climate Adaptation Science Center's Project Spotlight, turning the science of connectivity into action and finding model consistency and identifying priority habitats for conservation. I'm Samantha Jordt. I'm a 2020-2021 Global Change Fellow, and I'm talking today with Dr. Jennifer Costanza. Dr. Costanza, would you mind introducing yourself?
I'm Jen Costanza. I'm a research ecologist with the U.S. Forest Service. And I did the research with the Southeast Cask when I was faculty at NC State.
All right, thank you. So to start us off, when we talk about connectivity, we're often talking about corridors or wildlife corridors. So what is a corridor?
I think corridor is used in a couple different ways. I think most specifically it can refer to like a linear, like a linkage between habitats, between two or more habitats that helps individuals, wildlife species move in between those habitats. And the movements can be, daily movements to sort of search for food or that kind of thing, or they can be longer term migration type movements, or they can be dispersal events, sort of as juveniles. The word corridor is also a lot of times used to describe places that aren't necessarily ideal habitat, or sometimes called core habitat, but might be less ideal habitat, or might just be a more natural area, but not specific habitat for a specific species, but it might link to better habitat, better core habitat for species.
Could you give us an example of a corridor that people may be familiar with?
Overpasses or wildlife crossings over roads that are, just maybe tens of meters long that just help, say, wildlife species like raccoons or squirrels or deer in an urban setting cross over a highway, for example, or any road can be a pretty substantial barrier to movement for any species. The Appalachian Trail might be a good example. There's a Mountains to Sea Trail in North Carolina. By planning for something that humans can use, you're also, those sort of greenways can also conserve habitat.
And would you mind giving us a quick summary of what this project entailed?
For the Southeast Cask project, we had 3 focal species we were looking at: black bear, timber rattlesnake, and Raffnest's big-eared bat. And so we knew they used some of the same habitats, but also varied in their requirements for sort of what they would use as optimal habitat. And then they also varied in terms of their movement ability, dispersal abilities, et cetera. And so we had maps of land use and land cover, but we had to convert them to something resembling sort of what places in the landscape would be optimal habitat for each of those species. And for that, we relied a little bit on expert opinion, and also we used some occurrence points where we knew species had been observed in the past. And then based on that, we developed models of sort of the existing habitat. And from that, the first step really was to identify what we called the core habitats, or the optimal habitats. They were large enough to support a population of each species, and were in good condition, quote, good condition in terms of what each species would need. And then the second step was to identify relatively natural sort of linear paths connecting pairs of optimal core habitat for each species. While we started with 3 species that used some similar habitats to one another, they all used bottomland hardwoods. The 3 species had slightly different outcomes in terms of their corridor networks that we identified, and the priorities and the threats to those networks as well. And so the ultimate result in terms of the corridors we identified sort of varied by species.
And now that the models and maps have been created, what's next?
I I think of the corridors that we identified as sort of a starting point, but then for more local implementation, you'd want to zoom in on that and add more information, biologically relevant information, and also more details on the ownership, et cetera, sort of which places might actually be more optimal than others, and then which places, if you were going to restore or potentially even purchase land for conservation or put an easement on or work with the landowners to put an easement on a parcel, like which landowners, which parcels might be worth doing those actions. But then, a second thing would be just informing similar efforts with other species, how those might align or might not align with the species that we studied.
What are the challenges to increasing connectivity in the Southeast?
Climate change is going to be a huge issue, and we're looking at sort of ways to promote individuals and species migrating, say, from even one state to another or one part of the country to another to track changes in climate. Then you need maybe a wider view of the region. And in some cases that might be totally restoring places that are not even natural at all, if you're looking at sort of wanting a very large corridor, say through the eastern US. The core habitats sometimes did not have official protected status, but often they existed in protected areas. But the corridors usually did not. When we look at the sort of habitat networks or connectivity networks existing for these species that we were able to map out, so the cores and then the corridors between those, we see that a lot of the core habitats are more in the coastal plain and then more in the mountains. And that's just a factor of what habitats or what places and natural areas still exist in the landscape and haven't been sort of wholesale or widespread converted for agriculture or for urban land uses. And so the Piedmont has been, a lot of the land in the Piedmont has been converted to agriculture and urban land uses. And, of course, some of that has been converted back to forest or has regrown as forest or other natural habitats. But the Piedmont ends up being sort of a connector between those two places. Anytime you identify sort of corridors through a mixture of land uses, and you're going to have a mixture, a ton of owners involved. And I think that's a challenge for conservation in the Southeast, and I think just in the East in general. Family forest owners make up a huge chunk of the forest land, whereas out west, a lot of the forest land, for example, is owned by public agencies, or managed and owned by public agencies. In the East and particularly in the Southeast, a lot of individuals own forests, and it's not up to any one owner to say make their parcel have good habitat. It's partially a sort of coordination issue, but in terms of like actually establishing, whether formally or informally establishing a corridor, but then it's also just the ecological integrity of a parcel really can depend on so many more landowners than just one. So I think that's a huge challenge. There's some talk about whether bottomland hardwoods might be used for bioenergy and biomass. And while we didn't address that in this study, that could be a future issue where some of those habitats are converted to.
It's already been a few years since this project was completed. With how fast land use and climate models change, is it also a challenge to stay up to date?
Land cover and land use information we used has already been updated, and some of the climate models we used have been updated as well. So yeah, it's an ongoing challenge. It's always in the back of my mind saying, like, when are these data going to be out of date? I see a lot of research moving in this direction, which is being able to just sort of have an automated set of models that you develop once, but then you can plug in new information as those become available, as the new data sets become available, and sort of not only change your model results, but also refine them and get more and more certain, less and less uncertainty, I will say, on the sort of future conditions, for example, as well. The results we have, while we did identify specific corridors and specific habitat networks for these species, I think, they can be sort of seen as a first cut, and then folks that want to implement them or are interested in implementing connectivity plans and priorities, for example, for increasing connectivity or increasing habitat within a more local landscape, is you would have more local information as well that would actually replace a lot of the regional information we had to use anyway.
Thank you so much to Dr. Jennifer Costanza for talking to us today about her work using regional information to develop models that identify priority corridors for 3 species in the Southeast. This modeling effort shows us that priority corridor identification is greatly influenced by the dispersal requirements of individual species. As a follow-up, Dr. James Watling compared these modeling efforts to other unrelated modeling efforts and found a similar pattern. There's little consistency among identified priority corridors from different modeling efforts. These results show us that just as no one corridor fits all species needs, no one model can identify all priority corridors. To wrap up, corridors connect remaining core habitats and are necessary for the survival of many species, given continued and accelerating land use and climate change. However, no one corridor fits all species, and no one model can identify all priority corridors. As Dr. Costanza mentioned, the corridors identified by a model or models are starting points. Thankfully, there are a growing number of models and other tools available to land managers to help identify actionable corridor locations. For more information on what we discussed today, here are a list of resources, and check out our blog post for the links.